Hey guys, this is Nick with Cymatics and welcome to video number 2 in our Hip Hop Beatmaking Foundations course. In this video, we're going to start off by selecting some drum samples that we're going to be using for our beat later. I'm just going to cover some general ideas and what you should look for when you should be looking for your samples. Because I assume you have large folders full of samples and you want to make sure that you're selecting high quality sounds, because selecting high quality sounds early on will help you a lot in the beat making process and you're not going to do as much work in the mixdown. So generally speaking, what I usually do is I create a bunch of MIDI tracks. I like putting my drum samples into MIDI tracks because I have more control over a lot of factors in the drum sample. I can switch the drum samples out very easily. So instead of, for example, having a drum sample and moving it into the track like this, let's just say I have an audio track here, and I move my sample into the audio track and then sequence it like this. First of all, I need to do a lot of complicated like copy pasting stuff. And if I want to move anything around, it's very hard to loop that across the rest of your track. So you have to delete it and do this. And if you ever want to switch the sample out, it's possible to do in Ableton Live, but it's not as elegant as having just a MIDI track. And you can have a MIDI track playing a sample in any DAW, it doesn't matter. But that's just generally how I like to do it. So I just use a simpler. You can use whatever sampler you have in your DAW. And I like to pick just a general selection of claps, maybe a snare, some hi-hats. I usually run 2 hi-hats, sometimes an open hat, and we'll be covering open hats in a different video, but yeah, sometimes an open hat and maybe a rim shot and a kick. And we're going to be covering the kicks and the snares again in a future video to be more specific. But in this video, I just want to show you guys what it is that I'm looking for. So I typically look for samples that have a waveform that isn't too squashed and looks like a cracker, like a saltine cracker. Like if you zoom into this waveform for this clap here, you can clearly see the outline of the waveform. There's no cutoff at any point. Whereas in some other samples, you're going to have a lot of clipping happening. So let me just show you what that might look like if I use my glue compressor. And I'm not going to play this because it's going to be way too loud, but I'm just going to put this up and then freeze this track and flatten it. So this is not something that you want to see. You see how it's starting to be like a square? This is ugly. Sometimes it sounds good. The problem is, I don't even want to know if it sounds good or not. It's going to be too loud. But the problem is that it's going to be very hard to mix it later because it's going to occupy way too much headroom and it'll have no dynamic range for you to actually do your own work in the mix, because you'll be just stuck with that sample and how it sounds. You can't really modify it in any way because it's just so clipped. So yeah, that's a very important thing I look for. And yeah, so generally, if you follow that, you're gonna have a decent sound selection. Also, when I check go for my samples, I usually look for a sound, especially for claps. I look for a sound that has a decent component, like in the low end, it has some bass to it, but not too much, and that it has a bit of snap to the sample, especially claps. So that sound to my ear, I know that it's going to cut through a beat because it has a bit of low end, which I can show you guys even just by loading up a spectrum analyzer. And let me just make sure I'm on the right, yeah. So it's a bit more visible with the EQ8 spectrum. It doesn't have too much sub in it. That's really good, because if there's too much sub, it's just going to clash with the 808. And it has a bit of a hump here, right here, which gives you that low end. And if I boost it, you'll hear what I'm talking about. And that's just naturally there. I don't have to bring it in with an EQ. And that'll take you a long way. That already, if you're looking for those things, like a nice snappy drum sample that isn't too clipped, that'll make sure that it'll cut through the mix a lot easier. You're not going to have to worry about compressing it or EQing it or anything like that. And thankfully, all these samples are pretty good. That's another really good one because it has that snap to it. And notice how all these different samples have different tonal qualities, like some are darker, some are brighter. That'll all come down to the kind of vibe you're going for in the beat, musically speaking, the kind of melody loop you have. If the melody loop itself is very bright, sometimes it might make sense to have a darker clap. Or if its melody is very dark, then sometimes it makes sense to have a brighter clap for that contrast. So that, you have room to maneuver there. But if the sample itself just doesn't have a snap to it or any kind of beef to it in the low end, then no matter what you choose, it's not going to cut through. So there's no need to go and find EQs to fix that problem when the sample itself is bad. Always rename your tracks. So we have a clap. Okay, so I go for some hi-hats. Hi-hats, it's a very weird thing to select without the loop. So we're going to be making a loop later on, but generally for hi-hats, again, this applies to all the samples. Make sure it's not hard clipped. Make sure you can kind of see the outline of the waveform. And I like the hi-hats that have a little bit of a gap in the middle, in the beginning. So if you look here, the hi-hat, when you play it, it doesn't sound like there's a gap, but there's a very small space in the beginning of the sample. And that you can create the space yourself by, moving the notes over a little bit in your MIDI. But I like the samples that have a bit of a slower attack like this, because it actually, for some reason, it just helps the kicks and the snares that sit underneath the hi-hat. They can poke through a little nicer, and actually the hi-hat itself is it's not as stressed in the mix when you push everything together at the end of the mix. When you push everything up against the limiter, the hi-hats will still be audible, because if they're very sharp and they start right at the beginning for the first sample of the sound, the first like micro sample of the sound, then it's going to disappear over top of a kick, over top of a snare. Whereas if there's a tiny gap, it'll actually let the transients of the snare and kicks come through, and the hat will play after that. And it's just a decent idea to look for samples like that. And if you can't find one, then you can just create your own little delay in the beginning of the sample. So yeah, I would definitely use that. Hi-hat. Hi-hat 1. I generally take another hi-hat. Something that sounds different than the first one. So this one has this kind of a short quality. I'm going to pick something probably that's a bit different tonally. Maybe something like this. Also has a gap in the beginning, so very different tonally, and we'll be able to combine them and mesh them together in an interesting way. Finally, yeah, so we're going to be talking about how to select all the rest of the samples later on, but those are the two kind of tricks that I look for when it comes to kind of the hi-hats and the claps and snares, because they're tricks that you're not really going to use for other types of drum samples, namely like the gap in the beginning and looking for a good snap in the claps, because those two drums, the hi-hats and the claps, they tend to actually be the most important when it comes to the overall power of your drum track. And in the kicks and snares portion of this course, we'll be talking about exactly how to find the low-end drums, so the kicks and the low-end snares. That'll actually, we'll figure out how to deal with that problem, because it's a separate problem. But yeah, that's generally how you're going to be looking for your samples. Make sure that nothing's clipped, nothing's too aggressively limited, nothing's too bright and too harsh to your ears. It's another very important factor. If a snare or a clap or a hi-hat is too sharp and grating on the ear, there's no point in picking it, because, I mean, you're just giving yourself more work to do in the mixdown when there's a whole lot of other hi-hat samples you can use. And yeah, so just those three things is what you should be looking out for. So I hope you guys learned something from this video. In the next one, we'll be talking about writing melodies. So we're actually going to be inching closer to having the overall vibe of the beat. And then that'll actually inform our sound selection for our drums as well. So thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.